Over the weekend, Australian officials have met in Germany to answer questions on the government's climate change response. Alongside Britain, South Africa, Brazil, Japan, Russia, well, Australian officials have had their climate efforts scrutinised by their peers. Considering Australia only emits around 1.4% of global emissions, I wouldn't have expected our efforts to be where the rest of the world's bureaucrats put their focus, but I was wrong. Indeed, according to reports, Australian officials were grilled on how our country, is tackling global warming by addressing gender and Indigenous issues. You got to be kidding. To take us through the latest madness, Environment Editor at the Australian newspaper, Graham Lloyd, joins us now. Graham, I tell you what, this is just an exercise in madness week in, week out. Particularly, I have to say, these international talk fests. I've sat around the edges of many of them, but I thought they might see some sense, but they don't. What's the latest? What was the reason for this particular meeting in Germany?
Well, this meeting, hi Peter, this meeting in Germany is really a follow-up to the meeting that was held in Poland in December. So the way these things work, as you would have observed, it's a rolling series of meetings that was probably determined never to end. And this one, they're really trying to finish off some of the details from the decisions that were half made in Poland, and they're preparing for the next meeting, which will be held one in New York towards the end of the year, and then another in Santiago in Chile early in 2020.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's a whole lot of hot air and emissions on the back of aircraft flying around to these events because they don't go with one or two public servants. There's a whole battery of them usually. Just on the issue of gender and Indigenous issues, how did they make their way into the climate debate?
Well, they've made their way into the debate. This is a meeting at which a number of countries, including Australia, have to give a report on how they're meeting what they've promised to do. Australia received 20 written questions, which it's answered, and then it's going to be grilled by other countries on what it's doing. It's very interesting. The first two questions were whether or not Indigenous communities were consulted in Australia's response, and what's happening in terms of gender issues and climate change response. And more than anything, it provides a window into where climate change sits within the broader UN programs. It's very much morphing into a desire to meet the Millennium Development Goals and really the extinction crisis that is happening, so biodiversity. And so straying a little bit from climate to include a much broader range of issues.
Yeah, but this was always where it was headed, right? It was the stalking horse under the guise of climate for massive amount of money to come out of developed nations to be redistributed to developing nations. It's basically the cash cow for wealth redistribution, and we'll call it climate change, we'll call it global warming, we'll call it extreme weather, we now call it a climate emergency. It doesn't matter about the name. This is the vehicle that it is. I mean, in terms of detail, remember the last time we spoke, we talked about that $100 billion global climate fund, and Australia under Scott Morrison said, we're not going to throw any more good money after bad. We're concerned about the probity around how this money will be spent. What's the integrity about the disbursements from this fund? There were very, very sort of scant answers provided, so Australia said enough, no more. We were criticised for it. Where's that up to?
Well, not surprisingly, that is one of the key issues that they're still trying to work through in Bonn. The Climate Fund has had a very bad reputation, and there have been great concerns about how the money has been managed and decisions have been made. Some countries have increased their contributions, and they're really trying to build towards this $100 billion a year by 2020. However, there's also, the key is a lot of the projects that have been funded have been selected on the basis of Indigenous participation or gender equity. So that really is the front line on this process, and where the sort of bit muddled thinking really on what is the best way to achieve CO2 reductions, if that's the objective.
Now, Australia has been criticised in the latest round of talks for use of the carryover permits out of Kyoto, but other countries have done exactly this as well, haven't they?
Well, I think this has probably taken a lot of the wind out of the criticisms that have been levelled at Australia on this issue. Britain decided last week that it also was going to include additional savings from the earlier rounds towards its future contributions. So if it's good for Britain, it's good for Australia. And I think it was really a no-brainer that this is, in fact, what was going to happen all along. If you like, what's happening now is the goalposts are shifting a little bit on how people are setting themselves up for the future. There's a lot of pressure for countries to increase their ambition and say that they're going to do more. Rather than focus on the Paris Agreement targets, there's a lot more emphasis now being placed on so-called carbon neutrality by 2050. And there was a hope among many that the European Union would agree to be carbon neutral by 2050, and they had a big meeting last week in Europe and they were unable to agree. So much like Australia has a division between the coal mining sectors and other areas, the same thing is playing out in Europe, where Poland and Czech Republic have said, well, look, we're not going to go along with this. How is that going to be achieved? So a lot of that momentum has really been taken out of these talks, and that could have implications for how things go later in the year.
I mean, this is the madness of that EU stoush over getting carbon neutrality by 2050. In the latest lot of statistics that we got out last week, only 2% of the world's energy is coming from renewable sources. Only 2% in terms of heating and transport energy is coming from renewables. This idea that between now and 2050 we can somehow turn that around to get to carbon neutrality is just crackers. I mean, this is such a massive issue. It's a money go round. As I said, it's a Trojan horse for expenditure and wealth redistribution. Do you think we're ever going to have a wake-up call that we look at this issue with fresh eyes and we start to put, if we're serious, start to put things like nuclear power genuinely on the table?
Well, I think there was a real wake-up call last week where there were two reports that came out, really, I guess, from opposite sides of the debate. One was from BP and the other was from the UN's advisory body on renewable energy. And they both came to the same conclusion, that demand for energy is increasing globally and renewable energy is running furiously to stand still. It's not making any impact as a percentage of total energy that's required. So if the hope is that suddenly the world is going to phase out coal or fossil fuels and it's going to do something different, it's a challenge that looks beyond what's presently on the table. And inevitably, I think people will start to look at what some people, including Bill Gates and others, have been saying, that the breakthrough in technology is what is really required to get the sort of carbon dioxide savings that people are saying are required.
Graham Lloyd, thank you so much for your time. I tell you what, you are must-read commentary and analysis on this issue. It's complex, but you stay right across, particularly the international developments. Couldn't do without you. Thanks very much for your time tonight.
Yep.